With the 2024 fantasy season run and done, we're looking forward to next year and Dynasty fantasy football. It's never too early to get your Dynasty team sorted for a run at that 2025 title. Today, I take you through my Dynasty running back rankings on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today we are talking Dynasty Leagues and I'm taking you through my running back rankings. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss any of our Dynasty content this off-season. If you want to check out the full rankings for all positions, go to ffdfantasyfootball.com. Plus, if you've got any questions, pop them in the comments below, or you can follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. We answer all of your questions over there. But today, we are talking running backs. We are talking Dynasty rankings. And I'm going to break down basically every player in my top 50. And it all starts off with Bijan Robinson. I know a lot of people have Jahmyr Gibbs at the top of their rankings. They're pretty similarly aged. But for me, Bijan is just the better option. Still very young. Used very effectively this season, finishes the running back 3, but he started the season very slowly. Having said that, from week 6 onwards, only 2 games outside the top 10. And in one of those games, he still went over 100 rushing yards. He was extremely effective, extremely efficient, extremely consistent. Anyone getting over 300 carries and over 60 receptions has got to be on your fantasy team. So for me, Bijan is number 1, but Jahmyr Gibbs is very close. Another asset that you really want to be getting your hands on if you haven't already. They seem to kind of be phasing David Montgomery out a little bit, but it's a little bit hard to tell exactly what's going on there. Both of these players are signed through to 2027, but Montgomery is 28 years old. So he is going to have to see his role reduce a little bit. We saw even with that split, Gibbs still had 250 carries and over 50 receptions, nearly got over 2,000 total yards. But we saw he was particularly effective when Montgomery was out late in the season. 3 of his last 4 games were top 2 running back finishes in those weeks. And obviously, he's now been excellent in the one playoff look he got as well. So I do think we're talking about a player who is going to be very good for the long term. We knew when he was drafted how talented he was. In fact, I even projected him in my NFL mock draft to the Lions that year. So not entirely shocking that he went that high because he is that good. He and Robinson are both fantastic players. Saquon Barkley has been absolutely amazing this year. He is a little bit older, obviously. He's 28, but I mean, if your plan is to win your fantasy league anytime in the next 2 or 3 years, he's someone you need to have on your team. Over 2,000 rushing yards is insane. Not to mention the receptions he got. Heaps of touchdowns. So many touches. 370 odd touches is insane. They're going to keep using him effectively. He hasn't had a lot of injuries. There was a knock on him at one stage that people said he's injury prone, which is just stupid. There's such a small sample size with running backs. They all get some injuries. None of his are going to be long-term issues. So he is someone that you definitely want on your dynasty teams, unless you're hitting a full rebuild. And if you are hitting a full rebuild, you want to sell him very, very high. Just note, by the way, all of my dynasty rankings are in PPR because that's the predominant league and it is the standard for Fantasy Pros, which I do all my stuff through as well. Number 4, a bit of a surprise. Breece Hall, already had some people commenting on that on my Instagram. And rightly so, he was very disappointing. Finishes the running back 16 this season. The offense just wasn't good. The run game wasn't good. His efficiency wasn't good. And he wasn't getting the same level of receptions to make up for it. Plus, I think there are also a lot of other players who kind of stepped up a little bit. Did have some boom games. He's still got the talent there. He is a really good running back. He just wasn't able to effectively put it out on the field this season. But because he is one of the top young running backs, given he's only 24 years of age, and I feel like he does have a true 3-down skill set, while a lot of others kind of need another bigger back or a smaller back or receiving back to complement them. That's why I have Hall so high. But there is a big gap between those top guys and Breece Hall for me. Right next to Hall and very, very, very close to him for me is Jonathan Taylor. The only reason he's not higher, he's not getting a lot of receiving work the last few seasons. In his first 2 seasons, he was getting like up towards 40 receptions. Last 2 seasons, he hasn't even had 20. Now, admittedly, he played less games the previous 2 seasons, but this season played 14 games, which is still pretty good. Only 18 receptions. We're talking like 1 per game. And when you're getting a point for every reception, that really hurts. Now, he's getting over 300 carries, and that really helps. But when you've got someone like an Anthony Richardson at quarterback, he is going to tend to want to run rather than check down. And that really does hurt Jonathan Taylor. And that is my main concern around him. Having said that, as the season went on, in the last 3 games, he averaged over 30 carries a game, which is absolutely insane. So, look, there's always going to be upside there. If they choose to use him like that later on in the season, as they did later in the season, next year, he is going to be absolutely incredible. He's still under contract with the Colts for a couple more years, but no matter where he goes, he's going to be one of the league's best running backs. Chase Brown kind of popped up and surprised last year. I expect that to continue this season. He was very, very effective. We saw they used him a lot. At one stage, he had 6 straight top 10 fantasy finishes. He was just consistently really good. They used him a lot around the goal line. It's a high-scoring offense. He's one of their 3 main weapons, along with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. I guess Joe Burrow as well, running the offense too. So he's always going to get a heap of points when it's so condensed into a few players, and you're going to be scoring so many points. So Brown is someone I like the idea of getting on my roster. Still relatively young, 25 years old. So the upside is there. He has more job insecurity than most other running backs above him, but everyone below him does as well. Like if you look at guys like a Kyren Williams, you've got Blake Corum there. Achane, I'm not sure he's an every down back. McCaffrey's old. Josh Jacobs. They brought in a heap of other running backs. Marshall Lloyd, for example's back next year. So everyone's got a bit of job insecurity in that range. So for that reason, Brown is someone I still feel okay about. But again, there is a gap down below Taylor to him. It's also a note, by the way, on why you should value running backs lower in Dynasty as opposed to in redraft leagues, because all of these guys are so insecure in their roles outside the top few, and age is going to hit them a lot earlier. You cannot trust them to keep producing. That's just a consistent way that things happen. I'm in fantasy leagues where there is the top wide receivers that were drafted are still fantasy relevant, and it's in like 6th or 7th year, whereas the top running backs drafted were gone 3 years ago. None of them are relevant anymore. So wide receivers are definitely where you want to hit it in Dynasty. Kyren Williams, very good season. I think there was always a lot of concern about them drafting Blake Corum so early, but Williams was the clear number 1 guy, and it wasn't close. Plus, the Corum injury, of course, kind of helps Williams with that security. He's in the last year of his contract. Oddly, he's actually the same age as Corum as well, which is kind of crazy, but he is the number 1 guy, and we know that running backs in the last year of their contract tend to get used very heavily. So I would expect him to continue getting used. The main knock on him is that, like Jonathan Taylor, doesn't get a lot of receptions. 34 is still not bad, but even with Matthew Stafford, they still don't target him a lot. He does most of his best work around the goal line. He's had 31 total touchdowns in the last 2 seasons, which is insane. If he starts to lose a few of them to guys like Corum, that's going to be an issue. But with Cooper Kupp kind of getting phased out a little bit, I do think Williams is one of the top 2 guys in this offense, and it does tend to be a pretty high-scoring offense. Devon Achane makes me very, very nervous. Love the talent. Was a big fan of him in college. I had him in college football. And he wasn't really used as an every down back. He was more used as a speed weapon. So it's really surprising to see him getting used to get over 200 carries last year. I do think the Raheem Mostert injury and then just general aging definitely made a difference. Plus, Jalen Wright wasn't very good, but I don't think they want to give him a lot of carries. They've kind of tried to avoid it when possible. They generally give him around 10 or 11 carries, but then he gets so many receptions. Is that going to continue to happen? I mean, Tyler Huntley, I think, was part of the reason behind that. When Tua was playing, it didn't happen to quite the same extent, but we did still see it happening. A lot of it is definitely part of their game plan. Plus, he gets so much work around the goal line that there's some upside there as well. For me, he's very risky, but the upside is huge. Double-digit touchdowns in both of his first 2 seasons. Drop in efficiency, obviously, but still rushing at 4.5 yards an attempt, which is still very respectable. And anyone getting 78 receptions in a season, I mean, in PPR, that's absolutely incredible. So he's a little bit lower because I'm a little bit nervous about what happens. But if you believe he's going to keep the similar role to what he's got now, then he's a top 4 option, arguably. So there's risk there, but there's massive upside, especially compared to some others. I personally think that they're going to keep using 3 backs a lot of the time, especially with one bigger back and then one kind of supplementary back, as they've done in the last few years. And that's probably going to hurt him long term. Christian McCaffrey, still number 9 for me. And that's pretty impressive for a guy that's about to turn 30. And had a heap of injuries this season. Obviously now dealing with a knee injury, but I do think he's going to be absolutely fine for this season. This season was a little bit of a wash, but that happened in 2020 and 2021, where he hardly did anything. Then he came back in 2022 and 2023, and he was a top 2 running back both seasons, had a massive 2023. So he is capable of having a season or 2 off and then coming back with a bang. I think it's very possible that happens again this season. We even saw in the 4 games he played where he still wasn't fully healthy, they were still willing to use him plenty. And they were in very tough matchups against teams like the Bucs and Packers, who actually have pretty good run defenses, really solid run defenses. So it's not really shocking that he struggled a bit. I think that he'll be back next year, and he'll be very good. If you're trying to win in Dynasty, he's a good player to have. The reason he's so high, even though he's older, is because, again, in Dynasty, running backs just age out so quickly that if there's a good running back, you might as well just strike while the iron's hot. Unless you're rebuilding, McCaffrey is a good option for you. Josh Jacobs, we kind of forget that he's so young. He's still only 27, and he's played 6 full seasons in the league, got over 300 carries for the second time last year with the Packers. Running back 6 on the season. Did drop off a little bit towards the end of the season, but started to actually get some proper touchdown numbers. 16 touchdowns in the season, which is tied for most, along with James Cook, for example. In fact, he had a touchdown in every one of his last 9 games, if you include the playoffs, which is incredible, with a couple of 3 touchdown games in there as well. When you're having that touchdown floor, it's massive, and it makes up for the fact that there were plenty of games who were getting no receptions. The question is, what do the Packers do next year? Do they keep doing this thing where they lean on their running backs? I don't really know. And the fact they've brought Marshawn Lloyd in, then not being able to use him, it might mean that we see Lloyd used a lot more. We saw they wanted to get Wilson and Brooks involved, especially in blowout games. And that does limit Jacobs' upside. And the fact that Lloyd's there and now healthy, that's also going to be an issue for him as well. James Cook at number 11. I think there's a reasonable argument to have him higher. My main concern around Cook is touchdown regression. He had 16 last season, but unlike with Jacobs, where that's kind of a thing he does, that's not what James Cook does at all. He had 9 total touchdowns of any type in his first 2 seasons. And this season, he had less carries, less receptions, and 3 times more touchdowns, which is pretty ridiculous. That is going to definitely regress. We know that Josh Allen loves a good snipe around the goal line. It is possible they've made a conscious effort to kind of keep Allen healthier by using him less around the goal line, but I do feel like teams are going to adjust to Cook around the goal line, and we're going to start to see Allen get used a little bit more. Plus, they just generally need to be passing better. Their passing game was pretty average this year. Still managed to work for them, but I do think we see that improve this season. Cook had pretty much exactly 1,000 rushing yards and barely 250 receiving yards, and yet he finishes the running back 9. That's so fluky, and there's so much chance of that regressing. So for that reason, I can't have him any higher than this. Even though he's a very talented back in a very good team, it's hard to trust him any higher than this. Bucky Irving, I would have a lot higher because the talent is there, but I just don't understand what they're doing with their other running backs. They clearly want Rashad White involved. We saw that when White was at Arizona State, that he did get used in a committee and was far more useful in that sort of situation. He did drop off later in the season. We did see that Irving started to get the bulk of the carries, and he did a very solid job with it. Is that what's going to happen next season? I'm not sure that they can really trust that to happen. I don't think they can trust Irving to have too heavy a load. He was very efficient when given less carries, and then when they gave him more carries, he became less efficient. Same thing happened with Rashad White. At some point, they've got to recognize maybe they just need to limit the carry of their backs if they want to have a lot of efficiency in their running game. So it is possible that occurs, and then we see Irving fade a little bit. Very talented back, still only 23. And White's only under contract for 1 more year. So it is possible that he's very good. I just think there's a lot of risk there with him, which is why he's a little bit lower than other guys who are in similar situations and have similar talents. Tyrone Tracy, I just need to shout out my man Kiwi. Every season he gives me one name that he absolutely loves. A couple of seasons ago it was Puka Nakua. He was massive on Puka Nakua. Was telling me I had him ranked too low everywhere. This is immediately after the draft, and he was spot on. This year as Tyrone Tracy. He's 2 from 2 recently. Admittedly, 2 years ago it was Cole Turner, so he's not 100%. If you don't know who Cole Turner is, exactly. But Tyrone Tracy, such a talent. I think he is going to be very good next year. Only finishes the running back 28, but that's because he hardly got used at times this season. When they gave him the load, he was effective despite the fact the O-line sucked and they were not really making his job easy. He wasn't getting a lot of touchdown opportunities, scored 6 touchdowns. But I do feel like we've got to see the Giants step up in the next season or two. And Tracy, I think, is going to be their every down back. Still very, very raw. Only played 1 season, but he's already 26 because he was a much older prospect. He's kind of like a converted wide receiver. So that kind of limits his long-term upside a little bit. But you do need to remember that even though he's 26, he's not a Josh Jacobs style 26. I mean, Jacobs is 27, but you know what I mean, where he's already played like 6 seasons, has a lot of touches on him. Tracy's effectively had, 250 career NFL touches, plenty of college touches, but that's not really the same thing. So for that reason, I do think Tracy's going to have a long career and he is going to be very effective. Having said that, massive drop-off from Irving to Tracy. Isaiah Pacheco, very hard to trust, wasn't very good this season when given the opportunities, but that's kind of going to happen when you're coming off an injury. We can see even in the playoffs, he's not being used a lot, mainly because that injury is still clearly hampering him. Got like 5 carries against Houston despite having 2 weeks off. It's really hard to trust him in general, but we've seen how good he can be when given the opportunity. Was very effective in his first 2 seasons, and he's with that Chiefs offense, and they do seem to want to run the ball. Will they continue with the committee situation? That's not typically what we've seen from Andy Reid in the past, but it's kind of worked this season, so we might see them convert to that. All of those concerns are the reason I don't have Pacheco higher, plus he's already 26 years old. Joe Mixon, look, he's been around forever, but you've got to remember that Joe Mixon, realistically, still the same age as Christian McCaffrey, despite having played 8 seasons, and he has been very good for a long time. Over 1,000 rushing yards the last couple of seasons, but not very efficiently. Missed 3 games and still managed to go over 1,000, which is really impressive. Lots of receiving touches, which makes a big difference, and lots of touchdown upside. So Mixon remains a guy that's got plenty of upside, but his age is the biggest concern for me. Can he keep doing it? I think he's got a couple of good seasons left in him. And I think for those couple of seasons, he should be at least a top 12 running back most seasons. If he can stay healthy this season, he just missed 3 games. But if he played all 17, he'd have been top 10 easily. So for that reason, Mixon's someone I still feel solid about. Just remember, if you're in a rebuild, Mixon is not someone you want in your team because he's not going to be useful within 2 or 3 years. Kenneth Walker, heaps of injuries this season. That just seems to be the Kenneth Walker story, especially this season. Obviously on IR with an ankle injury to end the season. Just couldn't stay healthy towards the end of the year. Had 3 separate times out, and we saw how good Zach Charbonnet was when he was out, and yet they still seem to lean on Walker, which is kind of incredible, despite the fact he was averaging 3.7 yards per attempt. There's a lot to scare you there, but the reason I've still got him pretty high is that his reception total was massive. He never had over 30 receptions in his first 2 seasons. This season, he played like 2/3 of the games, and yet he had 46 receptions, which is nearly doubles his career total. If he played 15 games, he definitely would have doubled his career total. So absolutely bizarre they started getting him involved in the running game when Charbonnet is so good in that area. Not really sure what they're doing with their running backs. It's really hard to make sense of. Having said that, I do think Walker is still a very talented player that you can rely on long term. Still only 25 years old. It's just Charbonnet being there and being so effective that there's this fear there, and that's why I can't rank him higher. DeAndre Swift had another solid season. You've got to feel like maybe with the new coaching staff coming in, Ben Johnson's going to find ways to use him more effectively. Having said that, does that mean we're headed for a committee situation? I don't know that it's going to be with Roschon Johnson, but even though Swift played 5 seasons, he's still only 26. So he's got plenty of time ahead of him. Plus, he didn't really get used much in his first 3 seasons. Got a lot of receiving work, which tends to be less onerous on the body. I think in his first 3 seasons combined, he had like 370 odd carries. There are running backs who've had that in one season. So even though that's upped in the last couple of seasons and affected his efficiency, I think we can just all agree the running game was bad in Chicago last season, and it should take a step up in the coming season. He should also have a little bit of touchdown regression. So I do feel like there's a lot of upside here. The problem is, are they willing to trust him with an every down load? The fact that he missed no games last season, only won the season before, hopefully gives them a little bit of hope. And it might be that they decide that they just want to ease back his carries to keep it that way and kind of increase his efficiency a little bit. All of those things combined make me a little bit afraid for Swift. That's why, for me, he's probably the last of the true every down running backs that I've got listed in Dynasty rankings. Except for this guy, Derrick Henry. Obviously, Henry has been fantastic, and he was absolutely incredible in Baltimore, averaging 5.9 yards a carry. That is absolutely ridiculous. 325 carries. Still not a lot of receptions, only 19 receptions, but that's not what you're getting Henry for. It's for the touchdowns. It's for the yardage. Top 4 running back even in PPR. Obviously, in non-PPR, that was even more impressive because the lack of receptions doesn't hurt him. He was the running back 2 in non-PPR, for example. So we know how good he is, but he's just played his 9th NFL season, and that is a lot of tread on the tires. Currently 31, and he's not getting any younger. It is hard to trust that he's got a lot more in him. I think we can't say after that season that he's going to immediately drop off, but I do think that they're going to need to start to combine him with someone else. I just don't trust he's going to be an every down back, and I don't trust it's going to last for very long. That's why he is lower for me than he will be in my redraft rankings. David Montgomery is my number 19, and my concern is the age here, really. He's now 28. He's still under contract with the Lions for a long time, but we saw that he was starting to get hit with injuries a lot. In fact, he always has been. He's hardly had an injury-free season, despite the fact they don't give him a very heavy load, but he gets so many touchdowns. He's had 13 touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. They increased his receptions this season, which helped. In fact, they over doubled them from 16 up to 36, so that really helps. The problem is that ultimately Gibbs is going to start taking over. Montgomery is going to remain a guy that they kind of use early in the game, and then they use Gibbs' speed as the defense starts to tire, and that's when a lot of the points are going to happen. So Montgomery will be involved, but you need the Lions to be very, very good for Montgomery to be helpful. That is why he is lower than most other players who would be in similar situations. Just such a great situation in one of the highest scoring teams. Talented runner, but I don't know. I don't really trust the situation. I feel like he's heading in the wrong direction. Chuba Hubbard's a weird one. They draft Jonathan Brooks, and then they give Hubbard a massive contract. I mean, I don't even know what you want to make of that. But we know that Hubbard is a good player, even though he finished the season on IR. I do think that he's more likely to be heavily involved next season than Brooks, who's obviously had a massive injury. Hubbard still managed to have 250 carries, 43 receptions, finishes the running back 12 in a team that wasn't very good for most of the season. And when they were, it's because Bryce Young was passing. It wasn't really the running game that was getting them going. So going 4.8 yards per attempt is pretty amazing. So I do see a lot of positives around Hubbard. Problem is he's already 26. He's already played 4 seasons. We kind of know what he is by now. The upside is capped. And the fact that Brooks will be back soon enough means he can't be an every down runner for too long. I do, though, think that he is talented enough to be a good, solid option for your dynasty team moving forward. Tony Pollard, someone that I struggle to trust, but the talent's clearly there. Went over 1,000 yards, had 260 carries. That's really impressive. And 40 receptions. And that's despite Tyjae Spears being involved a lot of the time. And even had an injury in there as well. So I don't know. Can you trust Pollard going forward? Well, absolutely not. We've seen what happens when he gets given too heavy a workload. He really struggled in Dallas, despite the fact he had less carries than he did this season. And his efficiency was once again really poor this season. 4.2 yards per attempt is not great, especially in that offense. And he's already 28. And Spears is coming up behind him and looking pretty solid. So hard to fully trust him, but we know that he can get the touches, and he did last season, so it possibly does again next season. Plus, there's got to be touchdown regression. He only had 5 touchdowns last season. So that's why I've got him ranked up here, but I do feel like I don't feel great about it. I feel like I've got him a little bit too high, and I want to ease him back. It's just that ultimately he is still a talented back who I think will be around for a few years in an offense that should be able to run the ball more effectively if they get a good quarterback. James Conner comes next and just signed that extra 2-year contract with the Cardinals, which is a bit wacky. I think we all thought Trey Benson was kind of going to take over at some stage and they just run Conner into the ground. They did kind of run him into the ground. He went over 1,000 yards, had one of his second most efficient rushing season of his career. That's despite this being his 8th season. But even at 30 years old, he still looks absolutely fantastic. He's massively underrated, had his second most receptions and receiving yards this season, and definitely has some touchdown regression available to him as well. So there's lots of upside there with James Conner. We know he tends to have a lot of 100-yard games, had 6 of them this season. So the talent's clearly there. I do think that he can continue it on for a little while. I think the contract reflects that, but how much longer, we just don't know. He just needs to stay injury-free, basically. He's never done that. Even last season, got through most of the season and then just fell away right at the end and ended up on IR. But for the most part, we have seen him struggle with health, and that is another big knock on him. Another player that struggled with health recently, and I think he's just kind of hitting that wall, is Alvin Kamara. It's hard to feel good about him moving forward. He hasn't played every game of the season since his rookie season, which is absolutely ridiculous. But even last season, still got 68 receptions, which is crazy. Ended up as the running back in Dynasty, in PPR, I should say. So look, there's always plenty of upside there with Kamara, but they had no other weapons. And you've got to feel like that's why that's happening. He's now in his 30s, really, really, really hard to trust. His efficiency was really poor last year. I've got to feel like they want to get Kendre Miller more involved, and I think they will. And I feel like Kamara's probably only got a year or two left in him. And in fact, that's what his contract reflects, a couple more years. And I think that probably by 2026, we're going to be talking about a guy that's totally fantasy irrelevant. Kind of falling off really quickly, like we saw with a Dalvin Cook, for example. Aaron Jones, also someone that's getting a little bit older and now also a free agent. He's obviously already played 8 full seasons as well. Kind of was okay this season, but finishing the running back 14 in a really good really good offense where you go over 1,000 yards and get 51 receptions. You feel like should be doing a little bit better than that. Aaron Jones, always such an efficient runner. 4.5 yards per attempt this season is the worst of his career, which is absolutely incredible. But at least he managed to stay healthy for only the second or third time, which is a big positive. But look, this is not a Green Bay situation where he's going to be a top 10 running back. He will fall away a little bit. In fact, we don't even know where he's going to end up. It's possibly doesn't re-sign in Minnesota. In fact, I think that's entirely likely, and could easily end up in a committee situation. There's just too many question marks here for me to really trust Jones. He's someone I'm probably leaning towards selling high on. Travis Etienne had a really frustrating season where he and Hank Bigsby kind of switch roles every week. Towards the end of the season, he was getting double-digit carries most weeks, but he had a couple of weeks where just nothing happened. Seemed to still be the receiving back, but I mean, he hasn't had a touchdown since week 2, which is absolutely insane. I don't really understand what they were doing. They weren't using him very well, but he's still a really talented back. He's only 26 years old. Bigsby's not better than him. So I don't understand why they're not using him better. I have to feel like that's going to turn around. I'm taking a little bit of a risk on him, but I am ranking him high based on the natural talent. He's just been so inefficient with his running, but I feel like that's more the O-line and the run game has just been terrible, and I feel like they need to improve it. So touchdown regression will happen. He needs to get a lot better. We are talking about a guy who was the running back 2 in 2023, so there is still that upside there. That's why I've got him ranked relatively high. Rico Dowdle, this was my favorite Dynasty guy all of last season. I have him everywhere. I've been in so many leagues, and I talked about him all last season. Ended up with over 1,000 rushing yards, finishes the running back 23, and he would have been significantly higher if not for the fact he really didn't become the clear lead back until after their bye week. So look, towards the end of the season, he was going over 1,000 yards most weeks. Certainly had four of his last 5 fantasy relevant games. In fact, 5 of his last 6, if you include receiving yards, were over 100 yards. So that's excellent, but he's never going to be that top guy. The Cowboys just aren't that good at the moment. Plus, he's a free agent, so we don't even know what's going on with that. It is possible that the Cowboys just decide they're finally going to draft a running back. I know a lot of people want that, but I don't think it's their biggest need. They don't really have a good receiver behind CeeDee Lamb. Their O-line is not what it used to be. Their defense, it's got some weapons on there, but they're really struggling to pay them all, and they're going to start losing them as well. They've got a lot of holes to fill. I feel like they're heading for a rebuild more than anything, and drafting a running back early is not the way to address that. The problem is, of course, that Jerry Jones is getting older, And I feel like he doesn't want to rebuild. He wants to win right now, and he's just going to go all in over the next couple of years. So they might end up drafting a running back anyway. We shall see. Dowdle has plenty of talent, but we don't know where he's going to be next year. If he stays in Dallas, is that even a good thing? Lots of question marks. That's why I've got him lower than many might think, despite the fact, as I said, based on last preseason, love the talent. J.K. Dobbins, really interesting one. I was really back and forth on him and Gus Edwards last season. I kind of felt like Dobbins had a really good chance of being good if he could stay healthy, and he did. And he finishes the running back 24 when he was healthy. Of course, he missed about from week 13 to 16, but he was pretty good aside from that. Not the most efficient runner. 4.6 yards per carry is not bad, but compared to what he'd done previously in Baltimore, that's a drop-off. But I guess everything's going to be worse compared to Baltimore. Did more than double his career receiving total, which really helped. He was close to being the receiving back. They did use Haskins, obviously, a little bit. But compared to Gus Edwards, he's very much a receiving back. I think he's going to be the number one guy this next year if they re-sign him. Of course, he's a free agent, but Gus Edwards is 30 years old and only has 1 year left on his contract. Vidal was being made inactive, like a healthy inactive in the playoffs, so they clearly don't trust him. Haskins is just nothing. He's just a receiving back. So Dobbins is the main guy, assuming they don't bring in a free agent or someone else. And I think that is a real risk. So we'll see what happens with him, but he's a bit lower down for me because I don't really trust what's happening moving forward. Speaking of trusting what's happening moving forward, I don't really know what's going on with Brian Robinson at the moment. They seem to want to use a real committee situation. That kind of makes sense, but finishing as the running back 29 on a team that was actually pretty strong, that's not ideal, especially when you have a couple of early 100-yard games. You expect to be able to rely on that, and yet he kind of faded towards the end of the season. Finished with 8 touchdowns despite having plenty of opportunities, only 4.3 yards per carry, which admittedly is a career high, but it's not great. So there's a lot of concerns for me around Robinson. I think he'll be good in the playoffs, but I think for the future, he's not someone I really want to rely on. Najee Harris, it's just an awkward situation. Both Harris and Warren are free agents. Harris has gone over 1,000 yards rushing in each of his first 4 seasons. He's always averaged around 4 yards a carry. And that's not a bump on him, not a knock on him, I should say. It's just they don't use him in easy situations to run him. They kind of just use him on early downs. They make it really obvious they're going to run and just go, hey, just do what you can. He's one of those like short yardage guys that ends up looking really inefficient. And that's why I can't have him any higher. But it's also why he's actually a better player than his stats suggest. Doesn't get used around the goal line enough. But if he ends up somewhere else, let's say he goes to, I don't know, Minnesota or something like that, all of a sudden the upside's massive because he's still pretty young and he's got a lot of talent. So for that reason, I feel okay about him, but the lack of understanding of what's going to happen with his job and the fact that he's been poor the last few years is why I can't have him any higher than that, because he could easily go to a situation where he's the backup. Ramondre Stevenson is nominally the backup at the moment, but they gave him a really big contract, which is a little bit insane. They did kind of have an out for that contract as early as this season, but probably after this season. But he was very inefficient, under 4 yards a carry. But the whole offense kind of sucked. You got to feel like Mike Vrabel, he has a history of getting his running backs going. So you have to feel like he's going to do a little bit better and he's going to get something out of Stevenson. So for that reason, I trust the talent. I feel like Stevenson is a good enough back to make something happen. That is, of course, assuming that they don't decide to just get out of his bogey contract. Let's talk about some of the lower down guys. Look for a little bit of value, guys that you might be able to trade for a little bit cheap. Rashad White is not one of those guys. Obviously, he is fading a little bit. Finished the running back 20 last season, but for me, he's a sell high because he wasn't actually getting used much down the stretch. In fact, in their first playoff game, he had 1 rush for 1 yard and 2 receptions. Not great. And even in week 16 and 17, had a total of 9 rushes. Now, he was getting a lot of receiving work at times, but we did see they started to trust Bucky Irving with that later in the season. He really only had big weeks when they had massive games and both running backs were having big games. So he's just very hard to trust. He was fantastic, as I mentioned earlier, at Arizona State, but that was in a real committee situation. They seemed to try to ease him into a committee. He was still fine, but then it turns out Irving was just better. So you've got to feel like they still want to have a bit of a committee, but they're not going to give White enough touches. So while he is still on this team, it is really, really, really hard to trust him. Still only 26 years old, has 1 year left on his contract. You got to hope that after this season, he goes somewhere else and gets a starting role, but I don't think that's particularly likely. I feel like he's more one of those deeper guys that you kind of just use as a flex or bye week play if you're desperate. Tyjae Spears, I feel like I'm a little bit low on him, but I don't really see it. I feel like he's still going to be stuck behind Pollard for a couple of seasons. He hasn't really shown enough to really bounce past him. He had some good games, but he was also averaging 3.7 yards per carry on the season. Had a big game in week 17 where he went for 95 yards, but he had 20 carries. So it's not like he's going over 5 yards a carry. That's not very good. Had plenty of touchdowns for a couple of weeks. Week 15 and 16, he had 2 touchdowns in each and got a lot of receiving work. But again, he wasn't very efficient. He just kind of got some usage. So I don't know that we can feel great about Spears moving forward. I feel like he's always going to be like a running back 2 on whatever team he's in. But it is possible he takes over for Pollard. And that upside is why I've got him ranked here and not any lower than some of the other guys around him. Trey Benson, very talented running back. But gosh, can we trust him? I mean, he just got placed on IR with an ankle injury right at the same time as Connor, which is not ideal. He was fine this season, like 4.6 yards a carry is not bad, but he definitely had some bad games. I don't know. It's not a great situation to go into when Connor's just been re-signed for a couple of seasons, but you do have to remember that Connor is still 30 years old, and Benson would be the natural guy if Connor is out. The other issue, of course, is they're not really using their main running back as an every down running back. They do tend to want to use a Demicado or a Dallas or someone else as a receiving back. So I don't know. It's hard to trust Benson because he's never really going to be an every down back, so that limits his handcuff value. But you do feel like he's the most likely of most of these handcuff guys to go into an every down role. Kendre Miller, another guy who could go into an every down role, but he just can't stay healthy. And he averages 3.8 yards per carry in each of his first 2 seasons. So it's hard to feel great about him. I do feel like they want to get him more involved and he's going to start taking over from Alvin Kamara, but I don't know that the talent's actually there. I don't think he's actually that good. We haven't really seen him do it at any point in time. He hasn't had many great games. In fact, he hasn't had any great games. So I don't know. I feel like he could stumble into a role, but I don't think the talent's actually particularly good. Only 23 years old, admittedly, and has already played a couple of seasons, or at least parts of a couple of the seasons. So, I don't know. If you've got him on your team, definitely hold on to him. He's someone you can probably not buy cheap anymore, but if someone's willing to sell him cheap, he's a good dart throw if you are struggling a little bit at the running back position, because I think in the next couple of years, he could end up in the starting role. Sincere McCormick, I think they probably end up deciding that he's going to be the starting guy, which is a bit wacky, but Madison's a free agent. Abdullah's a free agent. Zamir White didn't end up looking like anything. So it's possible they just go McCormick's the guy. He was averaging 4.7 yards a carry and a very, very, very limited sample size. But that was against good run defenses. Remember, he did that against the Chiefs. He had 12 carries. Against the Bucks, he had 15 carries. And against Atlanta, he had 7 carries. And he did struggle against Atlanta because everyone does. And even against Denver was the only other game he played. They are all good run defenses. So going 4.7 yards per attempt, it's actually pretty impressive. So I do feel like potentially he's going to get some opportunities here to be the starting back. Will it happen? I don't know. But I think there's a reasonable chance. And that's why I'm willing to rank him in this range. Jonathan Brooks, very sadly getting that massive injury. You just got, my heart goes out to him. Tearing ACL again, that sucks. That's really, there's a good chance this ruins his NFL career, realistically. Never really fully came back from it. Didn't look good in the games he played, admittedly against some very tough teams. And now he's injured again. We don't know what's going to happen long term. I'm not going to speculate right now. But I feel like because of the talent, because of how much draft stock they put into him, potentially they're at least going to give him opportunities at some stage, but you might have to wait a little bit. He's definitely not someone you can use in the near future. Nick Chubb obviously had that big injury. Hard to feel great about Chubb, but they gave him a lot of touches when he was healthy. But having a broken foot, that's no joke. It is the kind of thing you can recover from, though, because it will fully repair, unlike a lot of other joint and ligament injuries. So for that reason, there is a chance he comes back. The problem is, he's not young. He's a free agent and he's injured. We've seen he can be a very good running back when he's healthy, but he hasn't been healthy since 2022. So I don't know that we can feel really good about him. He also is not a receiving back at all. He's never had 300 receiving yards in a season. So more of a touchdown guy. We don't know who he's going to be playing for. I do think he probably comes back to Cleveland, but I don't know. Is that a good thing? I think probably not. I think this is an awkward situation, and I have him in my main Dynasty league, and I won't drop him, but I certainly don't feel good about having him, and I'll trade him away if I can. Zach Charbonnet, I mean, realistically, we're talking about one of the best handcuffs in the league. Kenneth Walker's not going anywhere. Charbonnet looks fantastic when given the opportunity. Was the running back one, for example, when Walker was out in week 14, week 16 and 17 was used a lot as well. Had 29 carries in those 2 weeks combined. When Walker doesn't play, Charbonnet gets a heap of touches. Doesn't look particularly efficient, 4.2 yards per carry, but gets a lot of receiving work. In fact, even on the course of the season, 42 receptions is actually pretty respectable for an every down back. So the fact that he's getting that in a bit part role, that's pretty impressive. Also got 9 touchdowns on the season, which is pretty incredible. So look, there's some upside there, but I don't know. You need a Walker injury or you need a change in situation, essentially. Blake Corum, similar situation, plus getting injured, absolutely not ideal. Although, like I said, with any bone break, most of the time, assuming there's no other issues, you're going to recover quickly. Somehow got 58 carries on the season, but only averaged 3.6 yards per attempt. He needs to be a little bit better than that if he's going to get it even close to displacing Kyron Williams. But he is one of the high upside handcuffs around the league, and that's why I like having him on my team. I feel like he's someone you can buy low on. Jerome Ford obviously looked very good when Chubb was out, but we don't know what's happening in Cleveland in general. Ford has one more year on his contract. It's only 26, but they very, very rarely want to give him an every down workload. Never had more than 12 carries in a game, gets a lot of receptions. I don't know that they really trust him for that reason, even though he's averaging 5.4 yards a carry. I don't feel good about having him in my fantasy team. The receiving work is obviously there, doesn't get used enough around the goal line, but it is possible he's the starting running back for the Browns next year. In fact, right now, if you look at their depth chart, given Chubb is a free agent, technically he is, along with Pierre Strong, and everyone else is a free agent. I think they're probably going to hit the rebuild and end up with someone totally different in there, and that Ford ends up being the backup. The upside's there, though. Tank Bigsby, we talked about Travis Etienne before. I think that Etienne's just a better player. Bigsby did average 4.6 yards a carry, but a lot of that was fluke. He had 7 touchdowns as well. But he just had a couple of big games. He kind of blew up against the Colts and against the Patriots, and there was really average outside that. He doesn't get receiving work at all. He had a total of 7 receptions this season, which is incredible because he had 168 carries. So for that reason, I cannot trust Bigsby at all. I've got him quite low for that reason. I just think Etienne's the better player. And I think that Bigsby is truly a backup, even though they've given him a few starts over the course of the season. Speaking of getting a few starts, Antonio Gibson became the Patriots starter towards the end of last season. He's still got a few years left on his contract, but he is 27. He's the same age as Stevenson. We've seen him work better as sort of that speed complement player who gets some receiving work. Of course, he used to be a wide receiver in college. I don't know. I just don't feel good about him. I don't think he's actually going to be the starting running back. I think we'll see that Mike Vrabel comes in and goes, no, Stevenson's the guy for me. And we end up with Gibson back to being that sort of committee back along with Stevenson, or potentially one or both of them ends up getting released. This does not feel good for me long-term with Gibson. Jaleel McLaughlin technically is the starting running back in Denver. Javonte Williams is a free agent. Tyler Batty's back. I actually think they like him a lot more than most realize. And of course, you've got Estime as well. So it's going to be a real mess here. McLaughlin was getting some starts later on, but he didn't get over 500 yards last season. His efficiency dropped as he got more touches. He was down to 4.4 yards per attempt. He gets a little bit of receiving work, but he doesn't do very much with it. In fact, he had 24 receptions and a total of 76 receiving yards. So he's getting, 3 yards a reception, which is absolutely atrocious. Not to mention the fact that Bo Nix loves a scramble. So I can't feel good about McLaughlin. We did talk early in the season about McLaughlin potentially being the lead back, and it kind of turned into that at times, but I don't feel good about that because you still couldn't use him in fantasy. Isaac Guerrero is essentially the San Fran backup running back now. Jordan Mason's a free agent, and he might re-sign. Elisha Mitchell's a free agent. I don't think he re-signs. Patrick Taylor's a free agent as well. So really, it's Guerrero backing up Christian McCaffrey, and we know how valuable that can be. And we saw Guerrero have that big game against Chicago where he put up 27 fantasy points, was the running back 2 on the week. No reason he can't do that again. He stayed healthy for most of the season, just had that minor injury in week 16, which was frustrating. But I do think we're talking about a guy who at least offers some good handcuff value in a very high-powered offense. Jalen Warren, he's never going to be forgot Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary, he's not going to be starting back again, I don't think. but kind of could be. They kind of started to give him a few touches. We know that he's someone that's trusted by teams. I don't think he should be a starting running back. He's 28, but has a little bit of handcuff value as a clear handcuff. And I don't think it's out of the question he goes somewhere and ends up being a starting running back, even though he's got a couple of years left with the Giants. I just think it's possible that they release him and give him an opportunity to sign elsewhere. And that's why I'm kind of ranking him up here. Jalen Warren, he's a free agent. He hasn't been great this season. Like 4.3 yards per attempt is not good, and he had less carries. I think the Steelers just in general struggled. Gets a little bit of receiving work, but I feel like he's going to move towards being a just receiving back, and that does have a little bit of value in PPR. But if you're in a deep league, but for the most part, he lacks the upside of most of the guys in this range. I just rank him here because he at least has some value compared to many of these guys who are getting 2 or 3 touches a game without an injury. Then we get into the true handcuffs. Ray Davis, Braylon Allen, Tyler Algier, all in that same situation. Davis, I have highest of the 3. Even though he's already 26 years old, he came out a little bit older, but I feel like he's got a really good skill set. I do like the talent. We've seen him look pretty good when given the opportunities. 3.9 yards per carry is not great, but it has something to do with the fact that he's getting used in a lot of short yardage situations. We've seen he can break off a long run, but they do tend to use him around the goal line. When you're on the 1 or the 2 yard line, you can't really go forward very fast. So that really limits your ability to have good yards per attempt. Worth noting that he got 133 carries last season, which is pretty crazy. Plus 17 receptions, 6 touchdowns is pretty good. He was the running back 42, which is crazy as a backup. He only had 1 game as the starter, and that was against the Jets, and he looked pretty good. So I do feel like Davis has plenty of upside. Braylon Allen felt really good about going into the season, but Isaiah Davis kind of came in and ruined that a little bit. I still think Allen has the more talent of the two. Managed to get 92 carries and 19 receptions, which ain't bad for a backup. I feel like there's plenty of handcuff upside there. Tyler Algier, I would have above both those guys, but he's just a little bit older. He's 25 now. He's played a few seasons, 3 seasons now. Has looked pretty efficient in the run game when that's happened. They do like using him as a complement to Bijan, but realistically only when the game's in control. And with the Falcons, because they're kind of like a mid-table team, a lot of their games end up being pretty close. So when they're well ahead or well behind, they'll use plenty of Algier, especially when they're well ahead. But you can't rely on that for fantasy. You really need a Bijan injury, and we've seen that hasn't happened a lot. Finally, Javonte Williams, look, awful season last season. We have to remember that he is a guy that was at least their every down running back the year before. I think his injury in 2022 is really hurting him. We've never seen him be particularly good, but he's averaged 3.6, 3.7 yards per attempt the last couple of seasons. Gets a lot of receiving work. He's had a total of 99 receptions across the last 2 seasons. And that's really where the upside here is. I think he turns into a receiving back, but it is possible he goes somewhere and becomes the starter. And that's why I've ranked him above most of those guys who are just guaranteed receiving backs. Other guys that I haven't listed here are worth mentioning. Guys like a Marshawn Lloyd, for example, could become a starter in Green Bay. So he's got a little bit of upside. I'm not sure what's happening with all the other Miami backs. Guys like a Jalen Wright, for example, Audric Estime in Denver could be a little bit interesting. There's plenty of backups like Roshan Johnson and Kenneth Gainwell who are technically handcuffs, but you can't do much with them. A couple of aging backs like your Kareem Hunts and Austin Eckler's, they've got very limited value. I don't know what happened with Jordan Mason, but I think he could, for example, could go somewhere new and end up being very effective. So that'll be interesting. But for the most part, they're my top 50 guys. They're the guys I'm happy with. If you got any questions, of course, always ask in the comments below or hit me up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My full Dynasty rankings for all positions are up at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and I've also got playoff rankings in there as well, and we will be talking about the NFL draft soon as well. If you've appreciated and liked the content, please leave a like and follow us on YouTube. That really helps me be able to get something out of doing these things for you. You can also find a couple of articles over at football.rasball.com, excuse me. I'll be back with some wide receiver content in the coming week or so. I look forward to you joining us then.